Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about personality disorders. Um, these are going to be a bit different than mood disorders and anxiety disorders and schizophrenic type disorders in that we are dealing with people's personality traits. So in our last unit section, we talked about personalities and all of these different traits that kind of make the difference between how people think, behave, and things of those natures. Well, sometimes these traits can be maladaptive and can affect how people interact with others, their job, and different things like that. And so that's what we're going to look at with personality disorders, how these clusters of traits can affect someone's interactions with others. So what we're going to focus on is learning what a personality disorder is, looking at the domains of general personality. That's addressing, again, Ocean. So those 5 major traits we talked about, these personality traits are going to fall within those general ranges. And you'll see what I mean when we get to that section. Looking at different personality disorders, we're going to have a little more than 6 because I've used supplemental sources, but you'll have all the information you need. And we will also identify the treatment for borderline personality disorder. Well, that's in your text. We're not going to do that for the sake of time on this PowerPoint, but we are going to look at what affects treatment, because therapy, when it comes to personality disorders, isn't as systematic or documented as mood disorders and anxiety disorders, and we're kind of questioning why that is, and we'll discover more about that. So with our introduction, let's just go back to what personality is. So it's looking at an individual's characteristic manner of thinking, feeling, behaving, and relating to others. So remember when we talked about those different traits? There's this idea that some trait theorists believe that those traits are going to be a description of personality characteristics. They are what we're going to look at in how a person behaves or interacts with people or feels on a consistent manner. So that's when we have this idea, if someone scores really high on openness, they tend to be imaginative, and that imaginative nature can span multiple situations. So that's what we look at in traits. How do they generally act? So with personality disorders, these are going to be more prevalent in adulthood than childhood. While there may be signs and signals, we can talk about mood disorders and anxiety disorders and how they affect children, but personality disorders are going to be evident in adulthood. Usually that's where we're going to see a deficiency in that personality in terms of, I would attribute that to how we watch someone develop, because at some point, we kind of grow and develop into who we are, and we see the different traits that people have, and where could certain clusters of traits be maladaptive or not beneficial to them. And so when we talk about these different personality disorders, we're going to look at 5 broad dimensions of personality. So you've heard of these before. These are going to be, remember that acronym OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So I found this really great chart to kind of show you that kind of what's on the opposite spectrum. So if someone scores high on neuroticism, for example, they are going to be fearful, apprehensive, bitter, angry, pessimistic. So when we think about the word neurotic, right, we're looking at all those different kind of traits that fall under that general domain. Versus the other end of the spectrum, which is emotional stability. So this is where people are cool, even-tempered, they're not quick to react, right? They're restrained and they're clear thinking. So maybe they're not as emotional in their responses. They tend to think things through before becoming concerned. And so remember, we talked about personality traits. Don't think of them as you are one or the other, but rather where you fall on a spectrum. Do you lean more towards extroversion or introversion? So make sure you look at this chart just to understand what's on those different ends of the spectrum, because when we look at these different personality disorders, we're going to see how different these general domains affect those personalities. We're going to see, for example, And some personality disorders are going to have maladaptive patterns in extroversion and conscientiousness, like narcissism. For example, narcissistic personality disorder. They're going to have different maladaptive patterns concerning different traits, and this is why we call them clusters. So when someone's diagnosed with a personality disorder, it's going to have significant distress on the individual or others. Because the thing with personality disorders is that they are called egosyntonic. This just means, basically, in a nutshell, that they're going to affect other people. Because when someone has a personality disorder, they aren't sure, usually, for a majority of personality disorders, they aren't aware of how this is impacting others. It's usually brought to a therapist's attention because maybe they've had some problems at work, maybe they've had some troubles with the law, and these personality disorders kind of come out, but they don't really bother the person, right? If you are introverted and extroverted, it may just be where you tend to fall tends to be who you are. It doesn't really bother you, but it's just kind of there. So that's kind of what we can think about with these personality disorders. They're not really aware of them because they don't bother them. It's not like depression. This is what's called ego-dystonic disorder, where it's focused on the individual. The individual themselves is experiencing the distress. So depression significantly affects the person who is experiencing the depression firsthand, whereas the person with personality disorder is not aware of how annoying, for lack of a better word, that it could be, depending on what personality disorder, of course. So again, remember, it's that constellation of maladaptive traits. It's not going to be just one. So with narcissism, you see facets of neuroticism, so they have an incessant need for admiration. Antagonism, so there's a lack of empathy there. Maybe they attack people. Conscientiousness, so these people try to seek acclaim. They're trying to gain all this ego boost for stuff that they say they did when really they're not good at it or they didn't do it. There's no basis for it. And extroversion, they want to exhibit themselves. They want to put on a show for everyone, to show off what they've done. So with narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, you may have heard about this disorder before because it kind of gets thrown around, but it's just focusing on the self and having this kind of high acclaim and prestige for oneself that has no fundamental basis. So if I'm going to exaggerate, this could be someone who believes they could compete in the Olympics in swimming and beat Michael Phelps, but they swam in a pool one time when they were 5. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but that would be a narcissistic claim. These people consistently do that. But that's just an example of what we're looking at. And so how do we kind of diagnose these people? Well, we're going to look at the authoritative manual, which contains the criteria for psychological disorders, as mentioned in previous sections. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, that's the most updated version, is going to have standard criteria that kind of tells us what these different personality disorders exhibit. And so we're going to look at all those disorders coming up. I won't list them here. But I will say it's been limited to 10 personality disorders, and this may not be all-encompassing of the different patterns that we've seen, because there are other specified personality disorders where we kind of see maladaptive patterns in someone's personality, but they don't necessarily fit our 10 disorder categories. So sometimes, maybe our criteria isn't expansive enough to contain all of the possible personality disorders that could be out there. So this is kind of the catch-all down here. So this isn't listed in your text, but it's important to know. Personality disorders are separated into clusters. And in those clusters, you're going to have similar kind of traits or experiences of those different disorders. So with cluster A, these are the odd or eccentric type of personality disorders. Odd meaning you have the paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. So let's just look at these really briefly because they're listed a bit in your text in terms of what factors of the big five that are affected by these. So I just wanted to give you a PowerPoint with a nice description that I got from our supplemental text, just to kind of illuminate the kind of things you would see in those personality disorders. So for example, let's look at paranoid. Excuse me. You all can read this, so I'm not going to read through the PowerPoint, but I will give you an example for paranoid personality disorder. So it says, harbors a pervasive and unjustifiable suspiciousness and mistrust of others, reluctant to confide in or become close to others, reads hidden meaning, demeaning or threatening meaning into benign remarks or events, takes offense easily, and bears grudges, not due to schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, because there are some parts of schizophrenia where people are paranoid. This is called paranoid schizophrenia, and it's supplemented with these paranoid feelings with hallucinations. So there are underlying psychological disorders there. But with personality disorders, this paranoid person is exactly what's exhibited. They just have a mistrust of others. So this could be someone who is not willing to confide in or become close to others. That could affect how could that affect their lives? How could this be maladaptive? I want you to think about that when you read about these personality disorders. How could not wanting to be close to others be maladaptive? How could that affect them? Well, maybe they aren't willing to work with others at work in group projects. Maybe they've entered a field where collaboration is necessary, but they're unwilling to do so because they don't trust others, or they think someone's going to steal their patent, or something along those lines. So that's what we're looking at with paranoid. And you'll see that schizoid, it's not paranoid in that they don't trust others, but it's just they don't desire to have relationships with others. So you see, they may not be bothered by this. They may not want to be affiliated with people. They have emotional coldness and detachment, indifferent to approval or criticism of others, lacks close friends or confidants. So it's not an autism spectrum disorder. That's important to remember because autism spectrum disorder deals with how people socialize with others. So you see there's a lot of different exceptions to these personality disorders because we are examining the traits. Let's move to cluster B. So cluster B is going to be your personality disorders that are labeled as impulsive, erratic, quick changing, very temperamental almost. These are people, for example, histrionic personality disorder. This is, I hate to use this term, but it's like the drama queen of this personality disorder. This is a person who is excessively overdramatic. I had a professor who described to me one of their clients who exhibited histrionic personality disorder. And I wish I could act it out for you, but you know, we're online. And they said that this client would march into the room, stamping her feet to draw all the attention to her into the session. And then she'd fling off her backpack, slam it on the chair, and go, ah, 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 and just grunt to get everyone's attention to show that she was feeling some kind of way, right? So they want to be the center of attention all the time. Now, we may have moments where we've done this kind of behavior, but this is on a consistent basis. So when we're looking at these personality disorders, these are going to be consistent, right? Because they're a trait. They're going to be generally how people act in an array of situations. Talked a bit about narcissistic personality disorder. There's borderline personality disorder, and this is going to have someone with an unstable self-image, mood, or behavior. These people are going to flip very frequently. So they're unstable in intense relationships. If someone has borderline personality disorder, this could be someone who has their best friend in the whole wide world. And let's say they decided to go meet up for lunch at 11 o'clock, or brunch at 11 o'clock the next morning. Let's say that person, their friend, showed up at 11:05. This may cause someone with borderline personality to be triggered and say, you're not my friend, you showed up late, you don't want to be with me, I can't believe you've done this to me. It was like an ultimate act of betrayal. Now that may seem like, okay, wow, that seems excessive, but that's how it works with borderline personality disorder, is it's unstable and it's quick changing. And so that's what we're talking about with this sense of an erratic nature. And one thing I want to mention about antisocial personality disorder, because some people use the word antisocial to mean people don't like people, like, oh, they're antisocial, they're mean. Antisocial does not mean you don't like people. It means that you are indifferent to people. So what that means is people are used as a means to an end. I want to make sure I say this right, but if you probably went through a lot of issues with criminal justice system, you would find a lot of people have meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, because it's this idea that you violate the rights of others. You don't see people as people, you see them as a means to an end. So it's like you're using them to get something. So this is like when you hear of someone robbing an old person of their life savings, and you're like, who would do that? Who would possibly do that? Well, perhaps it could be, not saying it's always the case, but perhaps it could be someone with antisocial personality disorder, because they don't see that person as a person who's worked so hard, who's trying to save for their family when they pass on. They see that person as a means to an end to gain that profit and to pay off their possible debts. So it's using people, essentially. And finally, we have cluster C. These are your more nervous and fearful personality disorders. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them because you can read. You know, I only want to clear up some of the ones that may be more confusing. So one thing I do want to talk about, avoidant and dependent are kind of self-explanatory, but with obsessive compulsive, I just want to clarify because that's different from obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is an ego dystonic disorder, and it's related to anxiety. Although now it's been changed to obsessive compulsive and other disorders in the latest DSM, but it's related to anxiety. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is what we think of. This is what's related to perfectionism, with an inability to complete tasks. So this could be someone who's so obsessed with the details, rules, order, and schedules. They're excessively worried about the details that they can't finish anything because they're so rigid. Things must be done this way. They must follow a certain suit. We have to follow this algorithm, right? That is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So now that we've kind of seen those different personality disorders, I know you're probably thinking, I know this is really brief, but you're probably like, well, that's great and all, but how do you treat those personality disorders when the people may not be aware of them themselves? Well, good question, because it's still not as documented as we would like. Why haven't we developed these treatment manuals for working through people's personality disorders? Why don't we have a systematic process like we do with helping anxiety disorders or mood disorders? Well, there's been kind of weak progress in treatment. Now, it's not necessarily the psychologists are doing a bad job, but it can also be there are not enough numbers. We don't have enough people seeking treatment for these personality disorders, right? Usually it's someone else who's forcing them to be there, whether it's work or some kind of court order or a family member. So maybe they feel like they don't have to change. It's not bothering them. They don't need to seek treatment. Or it could be that the treatment is so complex and varies so much for each individual that we can't really systematize it. Is that a word? Anyway, we can't make it systematic and say, oh, this is going to work for everybody. This method will work for everybody with borderline personality disorder, right? It may vary based on the individuals. So we want to do what we try to do with all psychology and look at general trends in treatment. But it's hard to pull those general trends if there's not enough numbers of people looking. So that's a cop-out answer to end this section on. But I'm sure I will disclose more when we talk about treatment and therapy options in the final section. I hope you all have a great week. There are more units. Just remember, you can listen to these out of order, but try to look at the anxiety one first, because it'll give you a little more background.